Silas Voss didn't knock when he walked into the county judge's office that Monday morning. He never knocked anywhere. He set a leather folder on the desk, smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows the outcome, and said, "My niece is unstable. Always has been. Her father knew it too. Why do you think he left her land instead of cash? Couldn't trust her with real money." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm just trying to protect what's left of the family." He was lying through every word, and he'd been planning this moment for 3 years. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a person who worked and bled for it, and smile while doing it, you already know exactly how Maris Alder felt when she found out. The question is, what would you have done with only 48 hours left? If this kind of story moves you, hit subscribe right now and follow along until the very end, because this one doesn't go where you expect. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Maris found out on a Tuesday. Not from a lawyer, not from a formal letter with a seal in official language. She found out the way most people discover the worst things in their lives, from someone who assumed she already knew. Martha Greer, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store in Red Hollow and had known Maris since she was 6 years old, leaned across the counter that afternoon and lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret at a funeral. "Honey, I heard your uncle's already spoken to Judge Calloway. Something about a guardianship hearing, day after tomorrow." Maris didn't move for a moment. She had a tin of lamp oil in her hand. She set it down carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid your hands might start shaking if you don't give them something precise to do. "A guardianship hearing," she repeated. Martha nodded, her expression caught somewhere between pity and discomfort. "They're saying you can't manage the property alone, that you need oversight." Oversight. The word tasted like something rotten. Maris thanked her, paid for the oil, walked out to her horse, and stood there for a full minute in the afternoon sun before she allowed herself to understand what was actually happening. Her uncle, her father's younger brother, the man who had stood at her father's grave and wept convincingly in front of half the county, had gone behind her back to a judge. He had constructed a case. He had done it quietly, carefully, over what must have been months, maybe longer, and he had timed it for a moment when she had no warning and almost no time to respond. 2 days. She had 2 days. She rode home. She didn't rush. Rushing felt like panic, and panic was the one thing she couldn't afford. Instead, she let herself think, really think, with the kind of cold clarity that sometimes only arrives when everything is already on fire. Her father, Thomas Alder, had died 14 months ago. Pneumonia. It had moved fast, and he had not been a man who liked doctors, which meant by the time she convinced him to let one through the front door, there was very little a doctor could do. He left her the cedar forest, 40 acres of old-growth timber that sat on the eastern edge of his property, and the house and the 20 acres surrounding it. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to be independent. Enough that a woman in her 30s in a county like this one didn't have to depend on anyone else's generosity or goodwill. That was what her father had understood. That was why he had written the will the way he did. And that was exactly why Silas wanted it. She'd known for years that her uncle resented the cedar forest. He'd made offers on it twice while her father was still alive. Reasonable offers, he called them, which meant they were anything but. Thomas Alder had declined both times without much ceremony, and the relationship between the brothers had gone cold after that. At the funeral, Silas had apparently decided that cold was no longer a strategy worth keeping. Maris dismounted at her front porch and sat on the top step. The cedar tree her father had planted the year she was born stood at the edge of the yard, tall and slightly crooked at the top, where it had taken wind damage years ago and grown around the break. She looked at it for a long time. She had no husband. She had no powerful family connections. She had a lawyer in town, old Warren Fitch, who was decent enough but who had already told her last spring, in a roundabout way, that a contested guardianship case was expensive and slow, and that judges in this county tended to side with family members presenting medical concerns, even when those concerns were vague. What kind of medical concerns, she'd asked him then. Emotional instability, he'd said, not meeting her eyes. Nervousness. Difficulty managing affairs, that sort of thing. It's a broad category. Broad enough to fit almost anyone, if someone's determined to make it fit. She hadn't followed up on that conversation. She had told herself she was being paranoid, that Silas was unpleasant but not criminal, that no judge would simply hand a grown woman's property to her uncle based on nothing. She'd been wrong about that. She'd been dangerously, foolishly wrong. The law in this county, in most counties, if she was honest, had one reliable weakness that worked in her favor, and she'd known about it since she was a teenager listening to her mother explain property disputes over the kitchen table. A married woman's estate could not be placed under the guardianship of a male relative. The husband's authority over the household was considered sufficient protection against exactly this kind of legal maneuvering. It was an old law, imperfect and rooted in assumptions she had no patience for. But right now, tonight, with 48 hours on the clock, it was the only door still open. She needed a husband. The thought didn't embarrass her. There was no room for embarrassment. She turned it over practically, the way her father had taught her to approach problems. Not with emotion first, but with clarity, then emotion, in that order. She needed a man who was known in this county, known well enough that a judge would recognize the name, known well enough that Silas couldn't easily attack his character or his credibility. Someone who wasn't in her uncle's pocket, which meant someone Silas had either ignored or disliked, which narrowed things considerably in a county where Silas had spent years building quiet alliances through loans and favors and carefully placed resentments. She thought of 4 men, dismissed 3 of them within minutes. One owed Silas money, one had a reputation for drinking that would hand Silas exactly the ammunition he needed, one was engaged to be married, and she wasn't about to destroy that. The 4th name sat in her mind with a steadiness she didn't entirely expect. Gideon Hawk. She didn't know him well. That was part of the problem, and she was beginning to think part of what made him the right answer. Hawk Ridge Ranch sat 7 miles northeast of Red Hollow, up in the rougher country where the land tilted toward the hills and the grass grew thinner but tougher, the kind of terrain that sorted out ranchers who were serious from those who were merely hopeful. Gideon had worked that land for 11 years since buying it at 30. He'd been married once to a woman named Clara who had died of fever 6 years back. People in town spoke about him the way they spoke about weather, simply and with a kind of respect for something they didn't entirely understand. He didn't come to town often. When he didn't say much. He paid his debts and kept to himself and had never, as far as she knew, been on the receiving end of any favor Silas Voss had to offer. That last part mattered more than she could explain. She stood up from the porch step. She went inside, made herself eat something even though she wasn't hungry, and then sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and tried to write down what she was going to say to him. She got 3 lines in and stopped. There was no way to write this. Some conversations could only be had out loud, in person, where you could at least watch someone's face and understand in real time whether you'd already lost them. She went to bed at 9. She lay awake until midnight. At some point before dawn she slept, though she couldn't have said exactly when. She was on the road by first light. The ride to Hawk Ridge took her through the lower valley, where the morning fog still sat heavy between the hills, and up along the ridge trail where the cedar trees gave way to open pasture, and the sky came in wide and pale blue, the way it did in early mornings before the day had decided what kind of day it was going to be. She hadn't sent word ahead. That had been a conscious decision, not an oversight. Showing up unannounced to ask a stranger to marry you was already a remarkable enough thing to do. Announcing it first would have given him the opportunity to craft a refusal from a safe distance, and she could not afford a refusal. She needed to be standing in front of him. She needed him to hear it from her face as much as from her words. The ranch came into view as she crested the last low hill. The main house, a barn that was better built than most in the county, a set of corrals that showed signs of recent work, a windbreak of cedar trees along the northern edge of the property that someone had planted deliberately and maintained with care. She noticed the cedars. She couldn't help it. He was in the yard when she rode up, working on a section of fence near the barn, not rushing, not dawdling, just working with the kind of steady attention that some people have toward the physical world, and most people don't. He looked up when he heard her horse and stayed where he was. She dismounted and tied her horse to the post at the yard gate without being invited to. That was the first thing she decided. She was going to behave as if she had a right to be here, because she did, because she had no time left to be tentative. "Mr. Hawk," she said. "Miss Alder." He set down his tools. He had dark eyes and the kind of stillness about him that some people mistook for disinterest, but that she suspected was something more deliberate. I wasn't hostile. He also wasn't warm. He was simply present, waiting. It's early for a social call. It's not a social call. He looked at her for a moment. Something in her face must have told him that, because he nodded once, slowly, and said, "Come inside." The kitchen was plain and clean. There was a coffee pot on the stove that was still warm. He poured 2 cups without asking whether she wanted one and set them on the table and sat down across from her, and she understood that this was how he operated. No ceremony, no performance, just the practical acknowledgement that whatever was coming required both of them to be comfortable enough to think clearly. She wrapped her hands around the cup, looked at him directly. "My uncle is moving against my property," she said. "There's a guardianship hearing before Judge Calloway day after tomorrow. He's had months to prepare it. I had until this morning to find out it was happening." Gideon said nothing. He was listening the way people listen when they intend to actually hear what's being said, not just wait for their turn to speak. "He'll claim I'm emotionally unfit to manage the inheritance my father left me. It's a lie, but it's a lie that's been carefully built, and I don't have time to fight it through the courts the normal way. I've talked to my lawyer. The case is expensive, it's slow, and in this county, the way things tend to go—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "There is one thing that would make the hearing irrelevant. One legal protection that would stop him before he even begins." She watched Gideon's expression. He hadn't moved, hadn't shifted in his chair. He was still looking at her with that same even attention, and she couldn't read what was behind it, which was terrifying and somehow also steadying at the same time. "Mr. Hawke, I'm asking you to marry me. Before the hearing, a legal marriage on record would make the guardianship filing invalid. He couldn't touch the property. Not through this avenue." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this part. "I know this is an extraordinary thing to ask. I know we don't know each other well. I'm not asking you to upend your life permanently. We can work out terms between us that are fair to you. But I need an answer today, because I have almost no time left and you're the only person I trust enough to ask." She had more prepared. She had reasons and explanations and contingencies she'd thought through during the night, arguments ready for every objection she imagined he might raise. She didn't get to say any of them. Gideon picked up his coffee cup, took a slow drink, set it down, and said, "All right." That was it. 2 words. Not even a full sentence by some standards. Maris stared at him. "I haven't finished. You've said enough." He wasn't being rude. His voice was completely calm. "Silas Voss has been working this county like a crooked card game for 15 years. I've watched him do it. I watched him go after the Pellman family when old George died. I watched what he did to the Creedy widow." He paused. "He's not going to do it to you." Something happened in her chest that she was not prepared for. Not gratitude exactly, something rawer than that. Something that had more to do with the shock of being believed, immediately and without negotiation, by someone who had absolutely no obligation to believe her. She had prepared for resistance. She had prepared for doubt. She had prepared for the reasonable, logical skepticism that any sane person would bring to a stranger showing up before breakfast asking to be married. She had not prepared for yes. "You should know what you're agreeing to," she said, because she felt she owed him that, even if it might talk him out of it. "Silas won't accept this quietly. He'll look for other ways. This stops the immediate hearing, but it doesn't end him." Gideon nodded slowly. "I expect not." "It could bring his anger onto you." "It could," he agreed. He didn't look particularly worried about that, which either meant he was braver than she'd expected, or he understood something about Silas that she didn't yet. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, the words coming out quieter than she intended, "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Why what?" "Why, yes. You don't know me. This isn't your problem." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking up an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how simply to say one. "Some things are somebody's problem," he said finally, just by virtue of happening nearby. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't a proclamation. It was just a sentence spoken by a man who meant it, and that, she would think later, was what made it hit her the way it did. She nodded, looked down at her coffee. "Then we have a lot to arrange before tomorrow." "We do," he said. And without any further ceremony, he got up and refilled both their cups, and they began. They spent the next hour at that kitchen table working through the practical architecture of what they were about to do. Gideon asked questions that were specific and useful about the hearing date, about which judge, about what documentation they would need to present, about whether Warren Fitch could file the marriage record quickly enough to be on paper before Silas's case was called. He didn't ask questions that weren't relevant. He didn't second-guess her account of events. He took what she told him as accurate, which meant he was either a very trusting man or a very good judge of people, and she found herself suspecting it was the second thing. There was a moment, mid-conversation, when she made an error in her accounting. She told him the hearing was at 10 in the morning when she actually wasn't sure of the time, and she caught herself and corrected it immediately. Gideon noticed. She could tell by the brief pause before he spoke, but he didn't make it into anything, just adjusted the plan accordingly and moved on. That mattered to her, the not making it into something. By the time the sun had climbed enough to call it mid-morning, they had a framework. She would ride back to Red Hollow, speak to Warren Fitch, have him prepare the documents. Gideon would follow within the hour, clean up, and they would go together to the justice of the peace. Simple. No ceremony, no fuss. Whatever neighbors happened to see them together in town would simply see them together. She stood to leave and then paused at the kitchen doorway, turned back. "Mr. Hawk." He looked up from the table. "Thank you." He nodded, just once. "Ride careful," he said. "The ridge trail gets soft after fog." It was objectively a strange thing to say to the woman you'd just agreed to marry, but she found herself almost smiling at it as she walked back to her horse because it was so completely without performance, so thoroughly practical, and she was beginning to understand that practical, in Gideon Hawk's language, was actually a form of kindness. She untied her horse and mounted, and she didn't look back at the house as she rode, because looking back felt like inviting doubt. She had a plan now. She had a partner, however unexpected. She had exactly 36 hours to make it impossible for Silas Voss to take what her father had spent a lifetime building. And somewhere under all the urgency and calculation and the strange, disorienting fact of the morning she'd just had, there was something else, small, fragile, barely formed, that she didn't have a name for yet. She didn't examine it. There wasn't time. She rode toward town as the fog lifted off the valley, and behind her at Hawk Ridge Ranch, Gideon Hawk was already pulling on his good jacket and moving toward the barn to saddle his horse. Neither of them had any idea what was still coming. Warren Fitch's office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco that hadn't been lit in years, which was somehow worse than if he'd actually been smoking. Maris had been in that office a dozen times over the past 14 months, and every time she walked through the door she had the same involuntary thought, that the stacks of files and folders along every wall were not organized so much as they were accumulated, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river. The man knew where everything was, which was remarkable given the state of the place. But knowing where something was and being able to get to it quickly were two different things, and right now she needed quick. She told him everything while he was still lowering himself into his chair. He listened with his hands folded on the desk, and his expression doing that thing it always did. The careful, measured look of a man who had spent 40 years being the person in the room who had to explain why things were more complicated than they appeared. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, which was never a sign of anything good. "Guardianship filing," he said. "Day after tomorrow." "Yes." "And you're proposing to counter it by establishing a marital union before the hearing date." "I'm not proposing it. I've already arranged it. I need you to file the paperwork and make sure it's on record before Silas's case is called." Fitch looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Who's the man?" "Gideon Hawk. Hawk Ridge Ranch." Something shifted in the old lawyer's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration, the way a compass needle swings and then settles. "Hawk," he repeated. He seemed to be thinking something through. "You know him well?" "Well enough." That was strictly speaking not accurate, and Fitch probably knew it, but he also, to his credit, didn't press it. He had been her father's lawyer before he was hers, and Thomas Alder had trusted him for 20 years, and Maris had always taken that as a reasonable enough endorsement of the man's judgment, even when his pace drove her to distraction. "This will work legally," Fitch said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. A valid marriage on record before the hearing renders the guardianship petition moot under county statute. Silas's filing would be dismissed." He paused. However what? However, Silas is not a man who accepts a single point of failure in his plans. He leaned forward slightly. If he's been building this case for months, and from what you're describing, it sounds like he has, he may have contingencies we haven't seen yet. Filing the marriage protects you from this specific attack. It doesn't necessarily protect you from everything. I know that, she said, one problem at a time. He studied her for a moment, and she could feel him deciding whether to say something else. Whatever it was, he decided against it. He straightened in his chair and reached for a form on the right side of his desk, which was a minor miracle of navigation in that office. Have Mr. Hawke come by this afternoon. Justice Alderman can perform the ceremony. I'll have the certificate filed before close of business today, which means it's on record before Silas's people even open their briefcases tomorrow morning. Maris exhaled something that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a sigh. Thank you, Warren. Don't thank me yet. He was already writing. Thank me when Silas is sitting in that courtroom tomorrow watching his case get thrown out. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She left the office and stood on the board sidewalk outside, blinking in the late morning light, and tried to think about whether there was something she'd forgotten to account for. It was a habit her father had tried to install in her from a young age. After every plan, he'd say, "Stand still for 1 minute and ask yourself what you haven't thought of yet." She hadn't always followed that advice. She was following it now. What she hadn't thought of, whether Silas had people watching her. The thought arrived cold and specific. If he'd been planning this for months, and he had, she was certain of it now, then he wouldn't have left the execution to chance. He would want to know whether she'd found out, whether she was moving, whether she was doing exactly what she was doing right now, which was moving fast and purposefully through town on a mission that would blow his entire strategy apart if it succeeded. She kept her posture easy as she walked back toward the general store, bought a few things she didn't need, said hello to 2 people she recognized, moved like a woman running ordinary errands on an ordinary Tuesday, which was, she was discovering, considerably harder to perform than she'd expected. Gideon arrived in town at noon. She spotted him from across the street before he saw her, or at least before he showed that he saw her, which she was already learning might not be the same thing. He rode in on a dark bay horse, moving at an unhurried walk, and he was wearing a clean shirt and had his hair combed back, which told her he'd taken the ride seriously without making a production of it. There was no nervousness in the way he moved. There was also, she noticed, no particular expression on his face that would tell a watching stranger anything about what he was in town to do. She crossed the street. He dismounted as she approached. "Fitch's office is 2 blocks down," she said, keeping her voice low and her tone conversational, as if she were giving directions to someone passing through. "He has the paperwork ready. Justice Alderman will do it there." Gideon nodded once. He looked at her briefly. Just a look, quick and quiet. And then they walked together toward the lawyer's office, in the kind of not quite side-by-side arrangement of 2 people who are moving in the same direction and haven't yet figured out their natural distance from each other. It should have felt more strange than it did. She wasn't sure what that meant. Warren Fitch had moved with surprising efficiency in the hours she'd been gone. The papers were on the desk in order. Justice Alderman, a compact, white-haired man who had been performing civil ceremonies in this county for 20 years and had clearly long since stopped expecting them to be conventional, was already present, and the whole thing was accomplished with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of paperwork, which was, Maris thought, probably the most honest version of what a practical marriage ought to look like. Alderman asked the questions. They answered them. He declared the marriage legal under county law with the brisk efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be, and Fitch filed the certificate before the ink was fully dry, which was the most impressive thing she'd ever seen him do. When it was over, she and Gideon stood on the sidewalk outside the lawyer's office with the afternoon sun at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. And she was aware of the fact that she had just married a man she'd known for approximately 5 hours. "That's done then," Gideon said. "That's done," she agreed. A pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present. "Fitch thinks Silas may have backup plans," she said. "He would." Gideon squinted slightly against the sun. "What kind?" "He didn't specify, just said we shouldn't assume this is the end of it." Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "No," he said finally. "It won't be. Men like Silas don't file 1 thing when they can file 3. He looked at her. "You should be at the hearing tomorrow. So should I." She hadn't considered that, and now that he said it, she felt the mild embarrassment of someone who has been so focused on stopping the immediate threat that they've momentarily forgotten to keep watching the larger picture. Of course she should be at the hearing, not just to watch Silas's case get dismissed, but to watch his face when it happened, to see which direction he turned when the floor dropped out from under him, because that direction would tell her something. 10 o'clock, she said. Calloway's court. He nodded. I'll be there. She rode home that afternoon with the marriage certificate in her saddlebag, tucked between a receipt from the dry goods store and a folded letter from her father's estate that she'd been carrying around for weeks without quite being able to look at. The certificate felt heavier than a piece of paper had any right to feel. She put it in the strongbox under the kitchen floorboard when she got home, in the same place her father had kept the original property deed and the timber survey records. Then she made herself eat dinner, cleaned up, checked the cedar tree in the yard the way she always did before dark, an old habit, absurd and unkillable, and went to bed. She lay there for an hour and a half before she slept. The courthouse the next morning had the particular atmosphere of a place where several different things are happening simultaneously and none of them are entirely comfortable. Maris arrived early, which meant she was there before Silas, which was intentional. She wanted to be seated and settled before he walked in. She wanted him to see that she already knew. He came in at 9:45 with a man she didn't recognize, younger, city-dressed, carrying a briefcase that had the careful newness of something purchased specifically to make an impression. Silas himself was in his good coat, the dark wool one he wore to church and to funerals, and apparently to proceedings where he expected to win. He was talking to the stranger in a low voice as he pushed through the doors, and he didn't see Maris at first. Then he did. She watched the micro-expression move across his face. Surprise, recalculation, something that might have been anger compressing itself into something smaller and more controlled. He recovered in under 2 seconds. He was good at recovering. That was one of the things she'd always found most frightening about him, and one of the things she'd worked hardest in recent years to stop being frightened by. He looked at Gideon, who was seated beside her. Whatever Silas had expected this morning, it wasn't that. He said nothing. He walked to his table and sat down and spoke to his lawyer in a tone too low to carry, and the lawyer opened the briefcase and began pulling papers out with a briskness that struck Maris as slightly forced, like someone who'd been told to look confident and was doing a technical job of it. Judge Calloway came in at 10 sharp. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a reputation for impatience and a record of efficient, if not always inspired, rulings. He didn't look at anyone particularly as he settled himself. He opened the file on his bench. He read something. He read something else. Then he looked up. This is the matter of Voss versus the estate of Thomas Alder, petition for guardianship of property. He paused. I'm looking at a marriage certificate, filed yesterday, between Maris Alder and Gideon Hawk of this county. He looked over his glasses at Silas's table. Counsel, I trust you're aware. Silas's lawyer stood. He was young, but he'd been coached. Your Honor, the petitioner would argue that the timing of this marriage raises significant questions about its validity and the circumstances under which the certificate is legally filed and properly witnessed, Calloway said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Whatever the timing, the marriage is on record. The statute is clear. A married woman's estate cannot be placed under the guardianship of a male relative. He closed the file. This petition is dismissed. 3 seconds of silence. Then Silas said something, not loudly. He was too controlled for that, but audibly, and his lawyer put a hand on his arm, which Silas ignored. Maris didn't catch all of it. She caught enough to understand that it was neither gracious nor particularly coherent, which was the first time she'd ever seen her uncle fail to be composed in a public setting, and she filed that away very carefully. Calloway gave Silas a look that contained a full paragraph's worth of judicial displeasure compressed into approximately half a second. Mr. Voss, I suggest you allow your counsel to guide you out of this courtroom. They left. Silas didn't look at her on his way out, which was its own kind of answer. Warren Fitch, seated behind her, leaned forward and said quietly, Well done. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more like the state that comes right after a very long run, wrung out, clear-headed, slightly unsteady, in a way she wouldn't show to anyone. She turned to Gideon. He was watching the door where Silas had just exited with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that level, patient attention he gave to things that weren't finished. He'll find another angle, he said. Yes, she said. He will. She wasn't wrong. The first 3 weeks at Hawk Ridge were stranger than she'd expected, though not in the ways she'd braced for. She had assumed there would be awkwardness. She had assumed there would be the particular friction of two people who did not know each other sharing a space and colliding over habits and routines and the invisible rules that every person develops for how their own life is supposed to run. She had prepared herself for it. She had decided in advance to be patient, to be pragmatic, to treat the situation for what it was, and not expect it to be something softer. What she had not prepared for was that Gideon Hawk ran his household the way he ran his ranch, without waste, without performance, and with a completeness that left very little room for friction simply because everything was already where it was supposed to be. He had cleared space for her things before she arrived, not in an elaborate way, just practically. A shelf in the main room in the wardrobe, a hook by the back door where she could hang a working coat. It was done with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness he brought to everything, and it hit her differently than she'd expected, those small, specific adjustments made by a man who had apparently simply decided she would have what she needed, and then made it so without making an occasion of it. She set her father's framed survey map on the cleared shelf. It looked like it had always been there. The days had a rhythm that she slid into more naturally than she would have predicted. Gideon was up before light. She was too, usually. She always had been, even as a child, something about the very early morning that felt like unguarded time, before the day had formed its expectations. They'd cross paths in the kitchen and she'd make coffee while he checked stock, and they'd eat before first light without much conversation, which suited both of them. He never asked her to do things the way most men would have, with the implicit assumption that because she was there, certain tasks now belonged to her. He simply noted what needed doing and divided it between them as if she were a ranch hand he was figuring out the best use of, which she privately found more respectful than any amount of courtesy would have been. But the problem was growing on the outside of those quiet mornings, not the inside. Silas had gone quiet after the hearing. That was what worried her. A loud enemy was a manageable enemy. You could track them by the noise they made. A quiet Silas was a Silas who was building something, and she didn't know what or from which direction it would come, and not knowing made the silence feel less like peace and more like the moment before a storm when the air pressure drops and the birds stop. She said this to Gideon one evening, about 2 weeks in, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with the lamp low because she'd been stretching the oil since it occurred to her she should start tracking expenses more carefully, now that two households had, in effect, been folded into one. She said it without much preamble, just laid the thought on the table the way she'd noticed they both seemed to prefer, directly, without decorating it. "He's gone quiet," she said. "After the hearing, nothing." Gideon had a cup of coffee he was working through slowly. He said, "I know." She looked at him. "You've heard something?" "Not heard, just Sal Greer's boy came by last week asking about the eastern fence line. Wanted to know if the property boundary ran to the Cedar Ridge or stopped at the creek." She sat up slightly. "Why?" "Didn't say. Said his father sent him with the question, just curious. But Sal Greer doesn't have land anywhere near my eastern line. He's got no reason to be curious about my fence unless someone asked him to go find out." The eastern fence line. That was the boundary nearest the cedar forest. Her cedar forest. "He's looking at access," she said. "That's what I think." She turned this over. Access to her cedar forest from Gideon's eastern property would require an easement, a legal right of passage across the land. Without one, no one could move timber through that corridor. But if someone could establish an old easement claim, a historical right of passage that predated the current property deeds. He'd need documentation, she said, thinking it through out loud. An old filing, something from when the land was first surveyed that established a right of access through this property to the Cedar Ridge. Yes. Does any such document exist? Gideon was quiet for a moment. Not that I've ever seen, not in any deed I've been given, but I don't have records going back to the first survey of this county. Nobody around here does, not completely. She pressed her lips together. He could fabricate one. The words landed between them with the quiet weight of something both of them had been approaching from different directions, but neither had said plainly until now. Fabrication. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. Deliberate, constructed fraud. He could, Gideon said. He said it without drama, in the same tone he used for most things, which somehow made it worse rather than better. The question is whether he'd risk it. He already forged my father's signature on a proxy document 3 years ago, she said. I couldn't prove it then. I'm still not sure I can prove it now, but I know he did it. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes. She was watching for the thing that happened with most people when she said something like that. The slight withdrawal, the imperceptible softening of their certainty, the hesitation that meant they were wondering whether she was sure, whether she was being perhaps slightly overdramatic, whether this was the emotional instability Silas had spent months describing to a judge. It was a thing she'd learned to watch for, and a thing she'd learned to hate in herself for watching for. Gideon just said, "Tell me what you know about the proxy document." So she did. She told him all of it. The land deal from 3 years ago that her father had claimed no knowledge of, the signature that bore his name on a document authorizing a sale of timber rights to a company she'd never heard of, the way the whole thing had been quietly withdrawn when her father raised enough objection that it would have become public and messy. She told him how she'd tried to get the original filing and been told it had been removed from the county record as part of the withdrawal. She told him how Silas had looked at her father at Christmas that year with the smooth, unconcerned expression of a man who knew that whatever you could prove and whatever had actually happened were two entirely separate things. Gideon listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "So he's done this before and gotten away with it?" "Yes." "Which means he knows how to do it without leaving obvious tracks?" "Yes. But he was careful because your father was alive and could contest it," Gideon said slowly. "Now your father's gone, and he thinks—" He stopped. "He thinks I'm alone," she said. "He thought I was alone." The correction hung there between them, the slight, exact weight of the past tense. Gideon picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking from it. "I want to go to the county records office," he said. "I want to look at every survey and easement filing that touches this property or yours going back as far as the records run. If he's building something, he'll need to build it into the existing record somehow. There'll be a seam. That could take days. Then it takes days." She looked at him across the table. The lamp threw shadows upward in that particular way it did when the flame was low, and he looked tireder than usual, or maybe she was just noticing it now because she was paying attention to his face in a way she hadn't quite let herself do before. "Why are you doing this?" she said. It came out differently than she intended, softer, less certain, more like a real question, and less like the rhetorical version she usually defaulted to when she was actually asking something that mattered. He looked back at her without immediately answering. "I said I would." "That's not what I mean." "I know it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a decent man. I didn't know him well, but I knew him enough. He built something worth protecting. You're trying to protect it." He looked down at the table, then back up. "That seems like a thing worth helping with. I don't need a more complicated reason than that." She believed him. That was the strange part. She simply believed him, which was not something she did quickly or easily with anyone. She had spent enough of her life watching people say reasonable things for unreasonable purposes that she had become deeply suspicious of easy sincerity. But there was no performance in him. There never seemed to be. Whatever Gideon Hawk said appeared to be a fairly accurate report of what Gideon Hawk thought, and there was a profound, almost disorienting relief in that. "All right," she said, "the records office. I'll come with you." "Good." He stood, took his cup to the basin. "Early morning, before it gets busy." She nodded. She sat at the table a moment after he'd gone to his room, looking at the cedar survey map on the shelf. Her father's handwriting on the margin, small and precise, noting measurements and landmarks in a hand she'd known all her life. She didn't take it down. She just looked at it, and the looking was enough. The records office in Red Hollow occupied the back half of the county clerk's building, which smelled strongly of mildew and the particular dry decay of paper that hasn't been aired out in several decades. The woman who ran it was named Dora Callett, who was approximately 70 years old, had been working in that office since she was in her 20s, and possessed a memory for filing systems that Maris could only describe as architectural. She knew where every document was because she had placed every document, and the fact that the organizational system appeared impenetrable to outside eyes was, Maris suspected, at least partially intentional. Dora looked at Maris when they came in, then at Gideon, then at Maris again, with the expression of someone who has already heard about a thing and has now seen it confirmed. "Mrs. Hawke," she said, with the faintest possible emphasis on the name. "Good morning, Dora," Maris said. "We need to look at the survey records. Everything that touches the Alder property and the Hawke property along the eastern boundary, all the way back to the original county surveys." Dora's expression remained entirely pleasant and entirely neutral. "That's a significant range of material." "I know." "Might I ask what you're looking for?" "Easement filings," Gideon said. It was the first thing he'd said since they walked in. "Historical access rights. Any filing that establishes passage through either property." Dora looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not suspicion, but a recalibration of the same kind Fitch had done when she'd mentioned Gideon's name. People in this county had their own files on one another, informal and reliable, kept in the kind of long-term memory that small communities develop as a survival mechanism. "Give me 20 minutes, Dora said, and disappeared into the back. She returned in 15. She came back with 3 bound ledgers and a separate folder of loose pages that she set on the reading table with the care of someone handling things that were fragile in ways beyond the physical. "The original survey records," she said, "the first county plat book, and the early easement register." She paused. "The early easement register has some pages missing." Maris looked up. "Missing?" "As of approximately," Dora pursed her lips, thinking. "I noticed it about 6 weeks ago. Pages 44 through 47. They were there last year. I specifically remember them because I cross-referenced that section when someone came in asking about right-of-way records in the Eastern Hills." Maris and Gideon looked at each other. "Who came in asking?" Gideon said. "A young man," Dora said carefully. "He said he was doing research for a legal firm. He had a letter of introduction." Another pause, more deliberate this time. "The letter was signed by Voss Land Holdings." The name sat in the room like something solid. Maris felt the cold move through her, but it was a useful kind of cold, the kind that sharpened things rather than numbing them. He hadn't just been planning to fabricate a document. He'd already been here. He'd already removed the records that would show whether a genuine historical easement existed or not, which meant that when his fabricated version appeared, there would be nothing in the official record to contradict it. The absence of the pages was itself the weapon. If there was nothing to compare it to, how could she prove a document was false? "Dora," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Do you have any record of what was on those pages? Any notes? Any cross-reference? Anything at all?" Dora Callett stood very straight. She was small and white-haired, and she had the look of a woman who had been doing her job correctly in the face of various forms of interference for approximately 50 years. "I keep my own index," she said. "I have since 1891. I don't trust these ledgers to be complete." She went back into the back. She came back with a small cloth-covered notebook that looked like it had been refilled and continued several times over the decades. The same basic book, just with new pages bound in as the old ones filled up. She opened it to a section near the middle, ran her finger down a column of entries in handwriting so small Maris had to lean in, and then stopped. "Pages 44 through 47 of the easement register covered the Eastern Hill properties," Dora said, "which includes the Alder grant and the Hawke purchase." She looked up. "There are 3 easement filings documented in my index for that section. 2 of them are standard irrigation access agreements, both expired." She paused. "The third is a note of challenge, a disputed easement claim filed in 1887 and formally rejected by the county surveyor on the grounds that the claimant could not provide adequate documentation of historical use." "Rejected," Gideon said. "Formally and finally. Rejected and closed." Dora's voice was perfectly level. "Meaning that according to the official record, there is no valid easement claim in that corridor. There never has been." The 3 of them stood in the quiet of the records room with that information between them, and Maris understood what it meant with a clarity that was almost physical. Silas hadn't just been looking for a document to fabricate. He'd removed the records that would have shown his claimed easement had already been disputed and rejected over 30 years ago. The fabricated document wouldn't just create a false right, it would erase the documented evidence that the right had been explicitly denied. It was brilliant, in the way that deeply dishonest things sometimes were. And it would have worked, except that Dora Callett kept her own index and had been doing so for 50 years, and had no particular interest in making anyone's fraud easier to execute. "I need a copy of that index entry," Maris said. "I assumed you would," Dora said. She had already turned to make one. Outside on the sidewalk, with the index copy folded carefully in Maris's coat pocket, Gideon stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Then he said, "He already has the document, or he's having it made." "Yes," she said, "which means we have some time, but not much. He'll wait until it looks like it didn't come too fast after the hearing. He won't want it to look reactive." "A month," she said. "Maybe 6 weeks. Then we need to move first." She was already thinking the same thing. Not waiting, not defending. Taking what they had, Dora's index, the documented rejection from 1887, the missing pages, the visitor from Vossland Holdings, and going to Judge Calloway not with a response to an attack, but with a case. An organized, documented, evidenced case that laid out not just this fraud, but the pattern behind it. The proxy signature, the withdrawn filing, the missing records, the timing, not one crime, a campaign. "I need to talk to Fitch," she said. "Tonight," Gideon said. She nodded. The afternoon light was coming at a hard angle through the courthouse windows across the street, and she thought about her father's survey map on the shelf at Hawk Ridge, and about the cedar trees she'd been looking at her whole life, and about the fact that Silas Voss had spent years believing that the best way to beat someone was to make sure they didn't see it coming. He'd made a calculation about her. He'd decided she was isolated, grieving, and manageable. He'd been wrong about all three things, but he didn't know that yet. He was about to find out. Warren Fitch did not receive visitors in the evenings as a rule. He had a housekeeper who made dinner at 6 and a habit of reading until 9, and a general disposition toward the idea that problems which arrived after dark could, in most cases, wait until morning. Maris had known this about him for years. She knocked on his door at 7:15 anyway. He answered in his vest and shirt sleeves, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at her, then at Gideon behind her, and then he stepped back and opened the door wider without saying anything, which was, she had come to understand, Warren Fitch's version of urgency. His study was warmer than his office and considerably more organized, which suggested to her that the chaos at the clerk's building was a professional choice rather than a personal one. He sat behind a small desk, and they took the 2 chairs across from it, and she laid out what they'd found at the records office in the same order she'd assembled it in her head on the walk over. Dora's index, the missing pages, the visitor from Vossland Holdings, the rejected easement claim from 1887. Fitch listened without interrupting. He picked up Dora's copied index entry halfway through and read it while she was still talking, which another person might have found rude, but which she recognized as him simply working faster than sequential listening would allow. When she finished, he set the paper down and looked at her over his glasses. "He removed the pages," he said. "That's what it looks like. That's tampering with county records. That's a criminal offense." "Yes," she said. "But we can't prove he did it personally. We can prove someone from his company was there asking about those records shortly before the pages went missing. That's a fact Dora will attest to." "Dora will attest to anything she observed directly and nothing she didn't," Fitch said, which was both accurate and the reason Dora Callett's testimony would be worth something. "What else do you have?" "The proxy signature from 3 years ago," Maris said. "I know I couldn't prove it then, but if we're presenting a pattern requires more than 2 incidents." "I know." She paused. "The Pellman family. Silas moved against their land after George Pellman died 6 years ago. And the Creedy widow, the one with the property on Mill Creek." She looked at Fitch. "What happened in both of those cases?" The lawyer was quiet for a moment. I took his glasses off his forehead and turned them slowly in his hands, which was something he did when he was considering how much to say and in what order. The Pellman situation was settled out of court. Margaret Pellman signed over the western 40 acres to a holding company after her husband died. The holding company was never publicly identified. He paused. "I handled her affairs. I told her she didn't have to sign. She signed anyway. She told me she'd been advised by a family friend that it was the safest outcome." "What family friend?" Fitch looked at her steadily. "She wouldn't say." Maris felt the thing she always felt when she got close to something that connected. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the particular nausea of seeing clearly how large something was. "And the Creedy widow?" Eleanor Creedy sold the Mill Creek property 18 months after her husband passed, below market value to a land company I couldn't identify at the time. She moved to live with her daughter in another county. I haven't spoken to her since. He set his glasses on the desk. I will tell you that when I tried to ask her questions before she left, she seemed frightened. Not of me, of something she wasn't willing to name. Gideon, who had been silent since they sat down, said, "So there's a method. Widow or orphan inherits land with value. Silas applies pressure, legal, social, whatever works. If they fight, he escalates. If they capitulate, he gets the land cheap." He paused. Maris was next on the list. "And she didn't capitulate," Fitch said. He looked at her with something that might have been respect, and might have been something more complicated than that. The look of a man who understood that he had perhaps not served his client as aggressively as he could have, given what he now suspected he'd known for some time. Which changed his approach from pressure to legal ambush. "Which we stopped," Maris said. "But he's not done. The easement fraud is next, and when that fails—" She stopped, thought about it. "There'll be something else. There's always something else with him. That's what nobody seems to understand. It's not individual attacks. It's a campaign. He doesn't stop when one thing fails. He adjusts and tries something different, and he keeps going until the other person runs out of resources or will or time." The room was quiet for a moment. "Then we don't respond to the next attack," Gideon said. "We don't let there be a next attack." Maris turned to look at him. "We take all of it to Callaway now," he said. "Not as defense. As a case. Everything. The guardianship ambush, the records tampering, the pattern with the Pellman land and the Creedy widow, the proxy signature. We bring it to the judge as an organized body of evidence that this man has been running a deliberate, systematic campaign of legal fraud against vulnerable landowners in this county. We ask for an investigation." He paused. "Not into one document, into all of it." Fitch leaned back in his chair. He pressed his fingertips together and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. And Maris recognized that this was him actually thinking, rather than performing thinking, which meant the idea was landing somewhere that warranted serious consideration. "The Pellman and Creedy situations are thin," he said finally. "The connections are circumstantial. I couldn't prove in a courtroom that Silas was behind either of them." "You don't need to prove them in a courtroom yet," Maris said, following the thread of where Gideon's idea was going. "You need to present enough for a judge to believe there's a pattern worth investigating. The investigation proves the rest." Fitch looked at her. "Callaway would have to be willing to open that door." "Callaway dismissed the guardianship case," Gideon said. "He's already seen Silas try something that didn't hold up. If we give him evidence that it wasn't an isolated miscalculation, that it was one piece of something larger, he's a judge who understands what happens to his courtroom's reputation if he lets organized fraud operate in his county unchallenged." Another silence. Longer this time. "I need to contact Eleanor Creedy," Fitch said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was him deciding something. "And I need to speak with Margaret Pellman, quietly, before we go to Callaway." He looked at Maris. "Can you give me a week?" "Yes," she said. "Then, can Silas move on the easement fraud in a week?" "He could," Fitch admitted. "But he won't. He'll wait at least 3 more weeks, possibly more. He'll want it to look spontaneous rather than retaliatory." He picked up his glasses and put them back on with the decisive motion of a man shifting into a different gear. "I'll start making inquiries tomorrow morning. Early." They stood to leave. At the door, Fitch said, "Mrs. Hawke." He said it the same way Dora had, with that slight, careful weight on the new name. "Your father would have fought this the same way you're fighting it. I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "He just didn't have the chance." She meant it as a simple fact. It came out as something more grief-edged than she intended, and she heard it and filed it away for later, when there was time to feel it properly. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and she stood on Fitch's front walk for a moment, breathing it in. "We're going on offense," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. She was surprised to find she wasn't scared. She'd expected to be. She'd been scared for so long. The low-grade, chronic kind that lives underneath ordinary life and only becomes visible when you stop moving, that she'd almost stopped noticing it. But standing there in the dark with a plan that was finally leaning forward instead of bracing for impact, The fear had moved somewhere else. Not gone, just rearranged. They walked back to where the horses were tied, and neither of them said much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had just decided something together and were both processing what it was going to cost. The week that followed was the kind of week that looks ordinary from the outside and is anything but from the inside. At Hawk Ridge, the daily work continued. There were always fences to check, stock to move, equipment to maintain. Gideon went about it with the same steady consistency that seemed to characterize everything he did, and Maris found herself doing the same, falling into the ranch's rhythms with a naturalness that surprised her every time she noticed it. She was not a woman who adapted easily to other people's spaces. She'd lived alone on her father's property for a year and a half since his death, and before that she'd run the household independently in most of the ways that mattered, because Thomas Alder's health had been failing for longer than any of them had openly acknowledged. She had, by necessity, become a person with very specific habits and a strong preference for doing things her own way. And yet, Gideon's kitchen had a different layout than she was used to, and she'd rearranged 2 cabinets in the first week without asking, and waited for him to say something, and he just looked at the change and then looked at her and said, "That's better, actually," and went back to what he was doing. She'd once spent 45 minutes fixing a leaky fitting on the water pump that she could see needed attention without being asked, and he'd come back from checking fence to find it done and said nothing except that the wrench she'd used was actually his second favorite wrench, which was how she learned where he kept his first favorite. They were learning the grammar of each other's days. It was strange, and it was not strange in equal and alternating measure, and she did not have enough unoccupied mental space to think about it too carefully, which was probably for the best. Fitch sent word on the 4th day. Margaret Pellman had agreed to talk. Maris rode to the Pellman place on a Thursday morning, alone. Gideon had offered to come, and she'd said no. This needed to be woman to woman, she thought, and she couldn't entirely explain why she was sure of it, but she was. Margaret Pellman was 61 years old and had lost her husband 6 years ago and had signed away 40 acres of her family's land to someone she'd been convinced she couldn't fight. She was going to be asked to revisit that, to say out loud what she'd been too frightened to say before, and Maris didn't know what response she was going to get, but she knew that bringing a stranger, even a quiet, non-threatening one, was the wrong choice. The Pellman house was smaller than she remembered from the one time she'd been there years ago, or maybe it just felt smaller because there was less life in it now. Margaret met her at the door herself, no greeting, just held the door and let her in, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee that neither of them drank. Margaret Pellman was a careful woman. That was Maris's first clear impression. Not timid, not broken, but careful in the way that people become careful when they've been hurt by trusting the wrong thing. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she listened to what Maris had to say with an expression that gave nothing away, and when Maris finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You want me to say it was Silas?" she said. "I want to know what happened," Maris said. "That's all. Whatever you're willing to tell me." Another silence. Outside the kitchen window, a bird was doing something persistent and repetitive in a tree, and Margaret Pellman looked toward the sound for a moment. "A man came to see me," she said, "about 3 months after George died. He said he represented a land management company that had identified some issues with our property boundaries. Potential litigation, he said. Very expensive to defend." She paused. "He said the simplest solution would be for us to transfer the disputed parcel to his company while the boundary questions were being sorted out. He said it would protect me from legal costs. He said the transfer would be temporary." "Was it temporary?" Her mouth tightened slightly. "No." "Did the man give you a name?" "He gave me a name. It wasn't anyone I'd heard of, but when I asked who he worked for, he said Voss Land Holdings." She looked at Maris directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "I knew the name. Everyone knows the name. I asked if Silas Voss was behind this, and the man said he wasn't at liberty to discuss his employer's principles." "What did you do?" "I talked to my son. He said fight it. I talked to a lawyer in the next county because I didn't want to use anyone local. I was already afraid of, I don't know. I was afraid." She stopped. "The lawyer told me the boundary dispute would be difficult and expensive and could take years and that he couldn't promise the outcome. And then 2 days later, someone broke the window of my barn. Not the house. The barn. Just one window, nothing taken. She looked at her folded hands. I signed the papers. The barn window, not the house. Specific, targeted, deniable. Just enough to make the message clear without leaving any evidence of intent. Maris felt the anger move through her, clean and cold. She kept it off her face. Margaret, would you be willing to tell Warren Fitch what you just told me? In writing, if necessary. Possibly to a judge. Margaret Pellman looked at her for a long time. The bird outside had stopped. He'll find out, she said. If I speak against him publicly, he'll find out. He'll already have lost most of his ability to act against anyone if this goes the way I'm hoping it will, Maris said. She tried to say it with enough certainty to be useful without making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. I can't guarantee your complete safety. I can tell you that you wouldn't be standing alone. Another silence, longer than the others. My daughter lives in this county, Margaret said. It wasn't a refusal. It was a fact. The weight she was carrying into the decision. I know, Maris said quietly. Take whatever time you need. Fitch will wait to hear from you. She rode home slowly, letting the horse set its own pace, and thought about barn windows and about all the small, specific, carefully calibrated ways that a person could be made to feel afraid without ever giving them something clean to point at. Gideon was in the yard when she got back, working on something near the corrals. He looked up as she rode in. She dismounted and led the horse to the water trough, and he walked over without being called and stood near enough that he'd hear her without her having to raise her voice. She'll talk, Maris said. She wasn't entirely certain of this. She was about 65% certain, which was not the same as certain, but it was enough to move on. He broke her barn window, after the man from Vossland Holdings visited her, just the window. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Same method he used with the Creedy family? She looked at him. You talked to Fitch? This morning. He tracked down Eleanor Creedy's daughter. Eleanor wouldn't talk directly, but the daughter said her mother had mentioned that someone left a dead animal on the porch of the Mill Creek house. He paused. 2 days before she agreed to sell. The window. The animal on the porch. Deniable, targeted, specific. 2 different families, 2 different forms of the same message, and both of them had folded. He's been doing this for years, she said. It wasn't a new thought, but saying it out loud with this specific evidence behind it made it feel different, heavier. Yes, Gideon said, and no one's ever put all of it together in one place. No, because nobody's ever had the reason to look at all of it at once. He looked at her. Until now. She handed him the horse's lead and he took it without comment and started walking toward the barn, and she stood there in the yard for a moment in the afternoon light, looking at the eastern horizon where, 7 miles away, her cedar forest was standing exactly where it had always stood, exactly where her father had planted his flag in it 30 years ago, and she thought, not this time. Fitch filed the request for a judicial inquiry on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the night they'd sat in his study. He filed it directly with Judge Calloway's court, addressed to the judge personally, and it was 43 pages long. Maris knew it was 43 pages because she had read every one of them, twice, and had caught 2 factual errors and 1 imprecision in the description of the 1887 easement rejection that Fitch had corrected without visible irritation, which was the most professionally generous thing she'd ever seen him do. The 43 pages contained Dora Callett's sworn statement about the missing records and the Vossland Holdings visitor. They contained the index entry documenting the 1887 rejection. They contained Warren Fitch's own account of the guardianship filing and the documented timing of its preparation versus when Maris had been notified. They contained Margaret Pellman's written account. She had called Fitch herself 5 days after Maris's visit, and she had been clear and specific and had asked nothing in return except to know when it would be over. Eleanor Creedy herself had not spoken. But her daughter had provided a written statement about what her mother had told her, which was admissible as supporting context rather than direct testimony, and which added one more thread to the pattern Fitch was weaving across those 43 pages. The document didn't accuse Silas of any single crime with the kind of ironclad proof that would hold up to a criminal standard. It didn't need to. What it did was lay out a pattern, methodical, detailed, cross-referenced, and ask Judge Calloway to look at it as a whole and determine whether an official investigation was warranted. Fitch had titled it simply, Petition for Judicial Inquiry into Systematic Fraudulent Land Practices, County of Red Hollow. When she read the title for the first time, Maris felt something she hadn't expected. The strange and disorienting sensation of seeing a thing that had lived only in her own head for years. Formless, impossible to fully articulate, always just slightly out of reach of the words available to her, suddenly made concrete and named and organized in ink on paper. It was a relief so large it was almost painful. She and Gideon went to Calloway's court the morning Fitch filed. Not for a hearing. There was no hearing scheduled yet. They went because Fitch had told them, in the quiet, pragmatic language he used for things that mattered, that it would be useful for the judge to see them in person when the filing landed. Not theatrical, not performative, just present. Calloway's clerk received the filing at 9:15 in the morning. The clerk read the title, looked at Fitch, looked at Maris, looked at the 43 pages with an expression that suggested he understood this was not a routine document and said he would bring it to the judge's attention immediately. They waited in the hallway outside the clerk's office. Fitch paced, which she'd never seen him do before. Gideon leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at the floor in a way that suggested he was somewhere else in his head, processing something. Maris sat on the bench along the wall and looked at her hands and thought about her father, which she tried not to do in settings where she needed to be clear-headed, but the thought arrived anyway and she let it come. And then she let it go, the way he'd taught her to do with feelings that weren't useful in the immediate moment. 40 minutes later, the clerk came back. Judge Calloway will see the petitioners. The judge's private office was nothing like the courtroom. Smaller, less formal, the desk covered in files and the shelves behind him dense with law volumes that looked genuinely used rather than decorative. Calloway himself was behind the desk without his robes, which made him look approximately 10 years younger and considerably more human. And he had the 43 pages in front of him with bookmarks at several sections, which meant he had read enough of it in 40 minutes to know where the weight was. He looked at all of them, Fitch, Maris, Gideon, and then he looked at the filing. "Mr. Fitch," he said, "I'm going to speak plainly because I expect you can handle that." "Please," Fitch said. "This document is making a serious allegation against a man who is known in this county and who has not, to my court's knowledge, been formally charged with anything." He paused. "At the same time, the evidence you've assembled here includes a sworn statement from a county records officer attesting to the physical removal of official documents, a documented pattern of distressed property sales with consistent timing relative to the deaths of property owners, and my own first-hand experience of a guardianship petition that appears, in retrospect, to have been deliberately timed to prevent the respondent from obtaining counsel." He paused again. Longer. "I dismissed that petition because the law required it. I did not at the time see the larger picture." "You couldn't have," Fitch said carefully, "without the surrounding context." "No." Calloway looked at Maris. "Mrs. Hawke, you believe there is more documentation to be found if someone with the authority to compel its production is looking for it?" "Yes," she said. "I believe the missing pages from the easement register are not lost. I believe they were removed and retained because they contain the documented rejection of a claim that Silas intends to resurface as a forged document. If someone with subpoena authority were to search Voss Land Holdings records—" "That's a significant step," Calloway said. "I know," she said. "But the pattern is there. It's in those 43 pages. And the only reason it hasn't been visible before now is that each piece was isolated from the others. Nobody had reason to look at all of it at once." Calloway was quiet. He looked at the filing again. He turned to the section about the Pellman land, read for a moment, turned to the Creedy section. His expression throughout was the expression of a man doing the uncomfortable work of revising his understanding of something he thought he'd already assessed. "I'm going to order a preliminary inquiry," he said finally. "Limited scope initially. The records tampering and the guardianship filing. That gives me the legal basis to ask questions I couldn't otherwise ask." He looked at Fitch. "If the preliminary inquiry surfaces what I think it might surface, the scope widens. That's all we're asking," Fitch said. Calloway nodded. He set the filing down. "Mr. Voss will be notified that his records related to county property filings are under review. He'll have legal counsel present, of course. He'll be advised not to destroy or transfer documentation." He paused and looked at them with the careful, controlled expression of a man who had spent decades being precise with language. I want to be clear that this inquiry is preliminary and that no determination of wrongdoing has been made. Understood, Maris said. However, Calloway continued, I also want to be clear that the pattern of activity described in this filing is, if substantiated, among the most systematic abuses of the county's legal infrastructure I have encountered in 30 years on this bench. He said it quietly, without emphasis, as if he were simply reading a fact from a page. I do not intend to allow that to continue. They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sun that felt sharper and colder than it had that morning, and the street was going about its ordinary business around them. Horses and wagons, and the sound of the smithy 2 blocks down. And Maris stood on the courthouse steps and felt the full accumulated weight of the last 3 weeks trying to settle into her body all at once. Fitch was already talking, quietly, to Gideon beside her, something about the likely timeline and what documentation they should secure against any attempt by Silas to move assets before the inquiry, and she heard it, but she wasn't entirely in it. She was thinking about Margaret Pellman's folded hands on her kitchen table, and about Eleanor Creedy's daughter writing down what her frightened mother couldn't say out loud, and about a barn window broken in the night as a message that was never supposed to be provable, and about all the other people in all the counties like this one who had received similar messages and signed the papers and moved away and told themselves there was nothing to be done. Gideon's arm brushed hers as he shifted his weight beside her, and she didn't move away from it. He knows something's happening by end of day, Gideon said. To her, not Fitch. When they notify him about the inquiry. Yes, she said. You want to be somewhere visible tonight, in town. Somewhere people can see you're not hiding. She looked at him. That was a specific kind of thinking. Not just strategy, but the understanding of what it meant symbolically to be seen, of how visibility itself was a form of statement when the other party had spent years relying on people's invisibility to operate. The hotel dining room, she said, 7 o'clock. He nodded. I'll put on the good jacket again. It surprised a laugh out of her. Brief, genuine, slightly rough at the edges. The kind of laugh that arrives when something hits you in a place you've been guarding for a long time without quite knowing it. She covered it quickly, not from embarrassment, but from the unfamiliarity of it, the sensation of laughing in the middle of all this and finding that it felt right rather than wrong. Gideon looked at her with that level, quiet attention. He didn't comment on the laugh. He just looked at her the way he sometimes did, like he was simply acknowledging that she was there, that she was a specific person in a specific moment, and that this was worth being present for. She turned back toward the street. Let's get Fitch's list of what to secure, she said. Then I want to go check on the cedar fence line before we lose the light. They went. Across town, in the office above the Vossland Holdings storefront on the main street of Red Hollow, a clerk was delivering a letter from the county court. Silas Voss received it standing, read it standing, and when he was done, he set it down on his desk with a care that was very different from casualness. He sat down. He sat there for a long time in the afternoon quiet of his office, and the expression on his face was one that very few people in this county had ever seen on Silas Voss, because very few things had ever required him to wear it. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the person he dismissed as manageable has been, for some time, managing him. The hotel dining room in Red Hollow was not a grand establishment by any measure. The tablecloths were white but not starched. The lamps were oil rather than gas, and the menu ran to about 6 items depending on what the kitchen had available, which varied by day and by what the cook felt like preparing. But it was the only proper dining room in town, and on a Wednesday evening it held most of the people in Red Hollow who were not eating at home, which meant that being seen there was, in the social arithmetic of a small county seat, equivalent to making a statement in a public square. Maris understood this. So did Gideon, which was why he'd suggested it. They arrived at 7 and were seated at a table near the window, which was not a coincidence. The window faced the main street, and anyone walking past could see them clearly through the glass. Gideon had worn the good jacket as promised. She had changed into the dark green dress that she'd brought from her father's house without quite knowing why she'd packed it, and she'd looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand at Hawk Ridge for a moment before deciding that she looked like herself, which was the best she could ask for. The dining room was about 2/3 full. She recognized most of the faces, and most of the faces recognized her, and she could feel the awareness move through the room when they walked in. Not the loud kind of awareness. Not the heads-turning kind, but the quieter, more durable kind that moves through small communities like a current through water. People noticed. People noted. That was the point. They ordered what the kitchen had. The food was adequate. The coffee was better than adequate, which was often the way of things in places that couldn't quite master everything, but had learned to excel at one thing. Halfway through the meal, Gideon said without looking up from his plate, "Don't look now, but Hetty Marsh just came in and has already looked at our table 3 times." Maris did not look. Hetty Marsh reports everything she sees to approximately 15 people before morning. "I know," he said. "That's why I mentioned it." She almost smiled. She was noticing that she almost smiled fairly regularly in his company, which was both pleasant and slightly alarming because she had not, in the past several years, been a person who almost smiled regularly in anyone's company. "Did Fitch give you his complete list?" she asked. "He did. I'll start on the property deed verification tomorrow morning. He wants the original survey markers confirmed, the physical ones, in the ground, before Silas can claim any of them have been relocated." Gideon turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It's grunt work. Walking the fence lines with a copy of the original plat and a measuring chain." "I'll come." He looked at her. "I know how to read a plat," she said. "My father taught me. I can walk fence lines." "I know you can," he said. He wasn't questioning it. I was just looking at her, in that particular way he had, that she was still not entirely accustomed to. 2 people is faster than 1. Then it's settled. They finished dinner and walked out onto the main street in the cool evening air, and she was acutely aware that they were being watched from the dining room window, not out of malice, but out of the simple, irresistible interest that people take in other people's lives when their own lives have gone quiet. Let them watch, she thought. Let them see exactly what they're seeing. They were halfway to where the horses were tied when she became aware of someone behind her. Not threatening, just the particular quality of footsteps that are following rather than coincidentally going in the same direction. She didn't slow down. Gideon didn't either, which told her he'd noticed too. The voice came before they reached the horses. "Maris." She stopped, turned. Silas Voss was standing 10 feet behind her on the boardwalk. He was alone, which surprised her. She would have expected him to bring someone, if only for the optics of not appearing to corner a woman alone on a dark street. He looked like himself. The good coat, the careful hair, the face that had learned to express only what it chose to express. But there was something behind his eyes tonight that was different from what she'd seen in that courtroom 3 weeks ago, when he'd recovered his composure in 2 seconds and walked out with his lawyer. He hadn't fully recovered from today. She could see it, just barely, in the slight tension around his jaw. Gideon had turned around with her. He stood slightly to her left, not in front of her, not positioning himself as a barrier, which she appreciated because she didn't need a barrier, and he seemed to understand that without being told. "Silas," she said. She kept her voice even, and her hands still at her sides. "I got a letter from the court today," he said. He said it conversationally, as if they were discussing something mundane, but the conversational tone was effortful in a way it usually wasn't. "I expect you know what it was about." "I expect I do," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then at Gideon, then back at her. "I want you to understand something," he said. "This inquiry, whatever you think it's going to accomplish, it's going to be slow and expensive, and it's going to turn up a lot of paperwork, and at the end of it, you're not going to have what you think you're going to have." "What do I think I'm going to have?" she asked. "You think you're going to bury me." He said it without heat, almost clinically, as if he were diagnosing a mistake she'd made. "You're not. I've been operating in this county for 20 years. I have relationships you don't know about and resources you can't see. This inquiry is a fishing expedition, and when Callaway's people don't find anything actionable, you'll have spent a year of your life and most of your savings on legal fees, and you'll have made an enemy you didn't need to make any worse." Maris looked at him. She'd been waiting, without quite knowing it, for this moment. Not this specific conversation, but the underlying thing that it represented. The moment when she had to stand in front of Silas Voss and not flinch. She'd been afraid of him for so long that the fear had become structural, part of the architecture of how she moved through her life in this county. Every decision she'd made since her father died had been made with some awareness of Silas somewhere in the background, some anticipation of what he might do next, some accommodation of the threat he represented. That accommodation was over. "You're telling me you have resources I can't see," she said. "That's probably true. You're telling me this will be slow and expensive. That's also probably true." She paused. "What you're not telling me is what's in the pages you had removed from Dora Callett's office, or what happened in the week before Margaret Pellman signed over her 40 acres, or why Eleanor Creedy found a dead animal on her porch 2 days before she agreed to sell a property she'd told 3 separate people she would never sell." Something moved in his face. Very small, very controlled, but present. She saw it. "I don't know what you're—" "You do know," she said. She wasn't loud. She wasn't angry, or at least she wasn't letting the anger drive the words. "You know exactly what I'm talking about because you did it. All of it. Not just with me. With my father's proxy signature 3 years ago. With the Pellmans. With the Creedy family. You've been doing this for years in this county to people who were alone and grieving and who you calculated wouldn't be able to put up a fight." She looked at him steadily. "You made the same calculation about me. I want you to understand that I know you made it, and I want you to understand why you were wrong." Silas was quiet. His composure was back, almost back, close enough that a stranger wouldn't have seen the difference. But she wasn't a stranger. "You got lucky," he said. The conversational tone had dropped away. Underneath it was something flatter, something that was closer to what he actually was. "You found a man to marry on short notice. That doesn't make you—" "I didn't get lucky," she said. "I figured out what I had and I used it." "That's not luck. That's the same thing you've been doing, except that what I have is the truth, and what you have is 40 years of practice convincing people the truth doesn't matter." She let that sit for a half second. "It's going to matter now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. A longer look, assessing, the look of a man recalculating the thing he thought he'd understood. "Hawk," he said. "Just the name." "Voss," Gideon said. Equally simple. His tone was the same tone he used for everything. Level, unhurried, without aggression or performance. He wasn't threatening Silas. He was simply being present, which, she was learning, was its own kind of statement. Silas looked back at Maris. Whatever he'd come out here to accomplish, to intimidate, to bargain, to make her doubt the course she'd started, she could see him recognizing that it wasn't going to work, and she could see him deciding what to do with that recognition. He was a man who adapted. That was what had made him dangerous for so long. He would adapt now too, but the adaptation would happen in a landscape that was no longer tilted entirely in his favor, and that was the difference. "You're going to regret making this public," he said. "I already regret a lot of things," she said. "Not acting sooner is at the top of the list." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked back the direction he'd come, and she watched him go with her hands still steady at her sides, and she did not look away until he rounded the corner and was gone. Then she exhaled. "You all right?" Gideon said. Yes. She was. She was shaking slightly, which she hadn't been during the conversation. The shaking arrived now, after, which was how her body had always processed fear, delayed, like an invoice that came a week after the expense. She didn't try to hide it from him. It seemed like a waste of energy. "He'll escalate," she said. "Not in a way he thinks can be tied to him, but he'll do something." "Yes," Gideon said. He was watching the corner where Silas had disappeared. "We'll be ready." She wasn't sure they would be. She was sure they'd try, which was not the same thing but was the only thing available. They rode home in the dark, and she noticed that Gideon set his horse's pace to match hers without appearing to do it deliberately. And she noticed that she had stopped noticing things like that with the faint alarm she'd felt in the first week, and she wasn't sure what to do with that observation. So she set it aside for later, which was where she was putting an increasing number of things. The preliminary inquiry took 6 weeks. In that time, the following things happened in roughly the order they happened. Calloway's appointed investigator, a methodical man from the state office named Harlan Vess, who wore the same brown coat every day and said very little but wrote things down in a notebook with a persistence that Maris found deeply reassuring, subpoenaed the records of Voss land holdings related to county property transactions in the preceding 10 years. Silas's lawyer filed 2 objections. Both were overruled. The records came in boxes, 7 of them, and Harlan Vess went through them with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he brought to everything, checking each document against the county's own records, in a process that took 4 weeks and several late evenings and required Dora Callett to be present for 3 full days of cross-referencing, which Dora performed with an expression of grim professional satisfaction. During those 6 weeks, Silas Voss attempted 3 things. The first was a direct legal challenge to the validity of Maris and Gideon's marriage, filed through his lawyer on the grounds that the marriage had been entered into under duress and without genuine consent. This required Maris and Gideon to each appear before a different magistrate and answer questions about the circumstances of the marriage, which they did separately, on the same day, in different rooms, and whose accounts Fitch later confirmed were consistent with each other in every material detail, not because they'd rehearsed it, but because both of them had simply told the truth. The challenge was dismissed within a week. The second thing Silas attempted was a campaign of social pressure that operated through the network of quiet alliances he'd built over 20 years. Business associates who stopped returning Gideon's nods on the street, a bank officer who suddenly found reasons to delay a routine transaction on Gideon's operating line of credit, a rumor that circulated for about 10 days about Maris's father's business dealings before it became clear that nobody who'd actually known Thomas Alder believed a word of it, and the rumor died of general disregard. The third thing Silas did was send a man to walk the fence line on the eastern boundary of Hawk Ridge at 5 in the morning on a Thursday, 2 weeks into the inquiry. The man didn't do anything. He just walked the line and looked at the markers and wrote something down in a notebook and left. Gideon found the boot prints in the soft ground near the eastern fence and followed them to where they ended at the road and said nothing about it that day. That evening, he told Maris. She went out to the fence line herself the next morning, before breakfast, while the light was still blue and the ground was still cold. She walked the full length of the eastern boundary with the original plat copy Fitch had given them and a measuring chain, and she confirmed every marker, every measurement, every recorded distance between the Cedar Ridge and the creek boundary. She wrote everything down in her own notebook, with dates and times, and her own name signed to each entry. Then she brought the notebook to Fitch. "Belt and suspenders," he said, when she handed it to him. "Just suspenders, actually," she said. "The belt is what I'm working on." He looked at her over his glasses. "You've become considerably more combative than you were 2 months ago." "I was always this combative," she said. "I was just doing it quietly." He almost smiled. Warren Fitch almost smiling was roughly equivalent to another person laughing outright. "The belt," he said, returning to the point, "would be finding the pages Silas had removed from Dora's register." "Yes." "Harlan Vess is looking," Fitch said. "If they're in any of those boxes from Vossland Holdings, he'll find them. If they're not," he paused. "If they're not in the boxes, it means they were destroyed or they're somewhere else. Somewhere Voss controls directly, not through the company." "His private office," Maris said. "Possibly. Vess can't subpoena that without expanding the inquiry scope, which requires Calloway to make a finding at the preliminary stage that justifies wider authority." He looked at her. "Which he will make if the boxes give him enough." "And if the boxes don't give him enough?" Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Then we have a harder road. Not impossible, but harder." She went home and did not tell Gideon that last part, not because she was hiding it from him, but because there was nothing useful to do with it yet. And she had learned in these weeks that Gideon was the kind of person who held difficult information steadily without it throwing him off his footing, which meant she could tell him anything, but telling him things that couldn't yet be acted on felt like unnecessary weight to put on someone who was already carrying enough. She was aware that this consideration for his weight was its own kind of information about how she thought of him. She did not examine it closely. What she did instead was bake a pie, which was not something she did regularly and not something she was particularly skilled at, but she'd found the dried apples in the back of the pantry, and it was a cold afternoon, and there was something about the straightforward manual work of pastry that her hands needed. The result was edible but asymmetrical, the crust browning unevenly because she'd misjudged the heat of the oven. She left it on the kitchen table and went to check the stock. Gideon came in from the corrals an hour later and found it there. He cut himself a piece, ate it standing at the counter with a fork, and said, when she came in the back door, "The crust is a little thick on the east side." "I know. Rest of it's good." She hung her coat on the hook by the door. "There's more if you want it." "I know where it is," he said, and put his dish in the basin and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the smell of apples and wood smoke and thought, with a clarity that was both startling and surprisingly uncomplicated, that she was glad she was here. Not because of the legal situation, not because of the cedar forest or her father's legacy, or the 43-page petition currently being considered by a county investigator in a brown coat. Just here, in this kitchen, in this house, where the crust was too thick on the east side and someone had noticed and said so and also said the rest was good. She was glad. She noted it. She filed it where she was filing everything else that wasn't immediately actionable, and she put the kettle on. Harlan Vess presented his preliminary findings to Judge Calloway on a Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Maris and Gideon sat in the courtroom alongside Fitch. Silas was across the room with his lawyer and a second man she hadn't seen before, who had the look of someone brought in specifically for this phase, older, more experienced, the city-dressed lawyer from the original hearing replaced by someone with more years behind him. The findings were read aloud by Vess himself, which was unusual, but Calloway had apparently instructed him to do it that way, and Vess did it without inflection or emphasis, the way a person reads something they want to be received for its content rather than its presentation. Among the 7 boxes of Voss Land Holdings records, Vess had found the following: documentation of 14 property transactions in the county over the preceding 12 years in which the sellers were recently widowed or recently bereaved. Of those 14, 9 had been completed below assessed market value. Of those 9, 6 had been preceded by a visit from a representative of Voss Land Holdings within 60 days of the seller's bereavement. 3 of the 6 transactions had been preceded by what Vess described as a documented incident of property disturbance: a broken window, a dead animal, a fence cut and left unrepaired, within 30 days of the sale completion. He also found, in the 5th box, behind a false back panel in a file drawer that appeared to have been factory original equipment but was not, 4 pages of county record paper, watermarked with the county seal, numbered 44 through 47. The courtroom was very quiet when he said that. Maris's hands tightened in her lap. She did not look at Silas. She was looking at Vess, and at the careful, flat expression of a man who was simply reading what he'd found. And she was aware somewhere in the back of her mind that she was holding her breath, and she made herself stop doing that. The pages, Vess continued, had been removed from the county easement register and retained in Voss Land Holdings private storage. The content of the pages documented the following: a survey of Eastern Hill properties conducted in 1887, 3 standard irrigation easements, and a formal rejection dated 1887 of a disputed access claim through the Eastern Cedar Corridor. A claim filed by a holding company whose principals, Vess noted, appeared through subsequent records to be the same family trust that later became the organizational predecessor of Voss Land Holdings. The claim had been rejected. The rejection was on those pages, and those pages had been in Silas's possession. The second lawyer, the older, experienced one, was already on his feet. He was good. He had objections prepared and he delivered them with precision, and Calloway let him deliver them, and then Calloway said he would be issuing a formal finding at the close of the preliminary inquiry, and the inquiry was being expanded in scope effective immediately. He said it without looking at Silas. He didn't need to look at Silas. Everything that needed to be said was already in the room. Silas's face, during all of this, was controlled. She had to give him that. Whatever was happening inside the architecture of his self-assurance, very little of it was visible on the surface. He sat straight, and he looked at the appropriate people at the appropriate moments, and his expression was the expression of a man who had lawyers for situations like this, and was relying on them, which was all a man in his position could reasonably do. But she looked at his hands, resting on the table in front of him, and they were very still in the way that hands are still when they are being held still, which is entirely different from the way hands are still when they are simply at rest. Outside afterward, standing in the pale winter light on the courthouse steps, Fitch said, with a particular careful precision, "The scope expansion means he cannot now move any property interests, transfer any assets, or conduct any land transactions without court approval until the inquiry concludes." Which means, Maris said slowly, that everything he's been building, every claim, every plan he has in motion, is frozen, Fitch said. Yes. She stood with that for a moment. He'll fight it, Gideon said. Not a question. Through every legal channel available to him, Fitch agreed. But the channels are narrowing, and the longer the inquiry runs, the more of those boxes get examined, and I suspect there is considerably more in those boxes than what Vess found in the first pass. She thought about the 14 transactions, the 9 below-market sales, the 6 visits preceding bereavement, the 3 incidents of property disturbance. She thought about all the people behind those numbers, people who had been alone and frightened and hadn't known that what was happening to them was also happening to someone else, that they were part of a pattern, that they had not simply been unlucky or weak or incapable of protecting what was theirs. Margaret Pellman, she said. Fitch looked at her mum. What about her? Her 40 acres. Is there a legal mechanism, once the inquiry concludes, if the fraud is substantiated, for her to recover the land? Fitch was quiet for a moment. That is a complex question that would require its own proceedings. But yes, potentially. I want you to look into it, she said, not as part of our case, separately, as something we're willing to help with. Fitch regarded her over his glasses. That could get expensive. I know, she said. Look into it anyway. Gideon said nothing, but she was aware of him looking at her with that level attention, and she did not explain herself because she didn't think she needed to. And the fact that she didn't think she needed to was its own kind of statement about how much had changed in these weeks since a cold morning when she'd ridden to a ranch she'd never been inside and asked a near stranger to upend his life for her problem. His problem too now. That was the thing she turned over as they walked back toward the horses. Somewhere in the past weeks it had stopped being her problem that he was helping with and become something that was both of theirs in a way she couldn't fully account for. Not just the legal situation. The whole thing, the ranch, the mornings, the slightly imperfect pie, the eastern fence line they'd walked together with measuring chains in cold air. She couldn't say exactly when the shift had happened. She suspected it hadn't happened in a single moment at all. She suspected it had been happening steadily, incrementally, in all the small, unremarkable moments that don't announce themselves as significant until you look back from some distance and see that everything is different from how it was. She reached her horse and put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and Gideon was already on his, and they rode out of Red Hollow toward the ridge trail as the afternoon light started to go gold and horizontal, and she found herself thinking about the cedar trees along the northern edge of Hawk Ridge, the ones she'd noticed on her first morning ride there, the ones that had been planted deliberately and maintained with care, and thinking that she wanted to ask him about them. Who planted them? How long ago? What made him choose that line to put them along? She'd ask him tonight, she thought, after dinner, when there was time. She was looking forward to it, and somewhere in that simple, uncomplicated fact that she was looking forward to a quiet conversation at a kitchen table in a house that had stopped feeling like someone else's house and started feeling like something she was part of, was a kind of warmth that she didn't try to categorize or contain or protect herself from, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. She let it be there. She rode toward home in the long gold light, and the cedar trees on the ridge caught the last of the sun and held it for a moment before the evening came, and the world was exactly as complicated and unresolved and ongoing as it had always been, and she was, in the middle of all of it, something she hadn't expected to be for a very long time. She was not afraid. She asked him about the cedar trees that evening. They were at the kitchen table after dinner, the way they usually were. Dishes done, the lamp turned low, the particular quiet of a house that has settled into itself after the day. She'd been carrying the question around since the ride home, which was a small and ordinary thing given everything else she'd been carrying lately, but it had stayed with her with a persistence that suggested it mattered. In some way she hadn't fully identified yet. The cedars along the north fence, she said. Who planted them? Gideon looked up from the piece of leather he was conditioning. I did. First winter I had the place. Why that line? He thought about it for a moment, which was what he did with questions he took seriously. He actually considered them rather than reaching for the nearest available answer. Wind comes down hard from the north in January and February, tears up the soil in the upper pasture. The cedars slow it down. He paused. Also, I just wanted trees. Seemed like a ranch ought to have trees you planted yourself. She looked at him. How long before they were big enough to actually do anything useful? 8, 9 years before they were doing real work. He set down the leather. They're still not as big as I'd like. But you planted them anyway, knowing you'd be waiting most of a decade. You plant things for the ranch you want, he said, Not the ranch you have right now. She sat with that. It was the kind of thing that sounded simple and wasn't, the kind of thing that contained a whole philosophy if you pressed on it. She thought about her father, who had planted the cedar at the edge of the yard the year she was born and watched it grow crooked at the top from wind damage, and never once talked about replacing it or straightening it, just let it be what it was, imperfect and alive and his. My father used to say the same thing about different things, she said. Not about ranching, about people. She paused, unsure why she was saying this, and then decided it didn't matter why, that the impulse was trustworthy. He said, you don't love the person someone is right this minute. You love who they're becoming. The right now version is just where you are in the middle of something longer. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was worth knowing. He was. She looked at the survey map on the shelf, his handwriting in the margins. I miss him most on days when something goes right, which I didn't expect. I thought I'd miss him most when things went wrong, when I needed advice. But it's the days when something actually works out that I think, he should be here for this. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp made its small sound. Outside, something moved in the yard. One of the horses shifting in the corral, probably, the sound carrying easily in the still night air. Today was a day like that, she said. Yes, Gideon said. Just that. She looked at him across the table. He was looking back at her with that same steadiness she'd been learning to read over these weeks. Not blankness, not distance, but a kind of attention that was simply, completely present. She'd spent a long time in her life around people whose attention was always half somewhere else, always managing something, always performing some version of interest while their actual focus was elsewhere. His attention didn't do that. It stayed. I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange, she said, and stopped. Go ahead, he said. I didn't come to you that morning expecting any of this. I came with a legal problem and a desperation and an argument for why saying yes was the least bad option available to you. I didn't come expecting, she gestured slightly, a small motion that was meant to encompass the kitchen, the lamp, the dinner plates in the basin, the whole ordinary weight of the life they'd been building in this house for the past 2 months. I didn't expect any of this to feel like something I wanted to keep. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she became mildly, quietly aware of her own heartbeat. Then he said, I know. She waited. I said yes that morning because it was the right thing to do, he said. That was the whole of it. I didn't think past that. He turned the piece of leather over in his hands without looking at it. What I didn't know when you rode up that morning was that I'd been running on empty for a while. Since Clara died. Not sad exactly, not anymore. Just running the ranch, fixing the fences, doing the work, like I'd gotten very good at the practical part and let everything else go quiet. He paused. And then you were there, and nothing about it was quiet. She let out a breath that was more complicated than a breath usually was. That's the most I've ever heard you say at one time, she said. Something shifted in his face that was the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him. Not the almost smile he sometimes did, but something that actually reached his eyes. Don't tell anyone, child, he said. I have a reputation. She laughed. A real one. Not the brief, startled version from the courthouse steps. A full, genuine, slightly undignified laugh that surprised them both. And she put her hand over her mouth and then stopped doing that because there was no one to perform restraint for in this kitchen. Not anymore. After, in the quiet that followed, she said, I want to stay. Not because of the legal situation. Not because it's practical, because I want to. Good, he said. It was such a thoroughly Gideon Hawk answer that she shook her head slowly, still half smiling. You're not going to make this into more of a moment than it needs to be, are you? Seems fine as it is, he said. She supposed it did. The inquiry's final report was delivered to Judge Calloway on the 14th of March, which was a cold, bright day that smelled like the very beginning of something turning. Maris knew it was coming because Fitch had told her the day before, and she'd spent the night sleeping poorly in a way that had become unfamiliar to her in the past weeks. Most nights at Hawk Ridge, she slept better than she had in years, which she'd noticed with mild suspicion, as if the sleep itself might be building towards some kind of debt. Harlan Vess had spent 11 weeks going through 7 boxes and a subsequent subpoena's worth of Vossland Holdings records, private correspondence obtained through the expanded inquiry scope, county deed records going back 30 years, and the personal financial records of 3 subsidiary land companies that traced back through layers of organizational paperwork to Silas Voss as the controlling principal. The report was 112 pages long and contained findings on 19 separate property transactions, of which 14 were flagged for evidence of fraudulent inducement, intimidation, or misrepresentation. It also contained a specific regarding the missing easement register pages, that they had been intentionally removed from county records and retained in private storage with the purpose of facilitating a fraudulent easement claim against the Alderhawk property, and that the intended fabricated document had been found in a partially completed state among correspondence in the 5th box. The partially completed fabrication. Silas had commissioned it but hadn't filed it yet. He'd been waiting for the right moment, the right distance from the guardianship case, just as she and Gideon had predicted that night at the kitchen table. He'd been too slow, or she'd moved too fast. Either way, the document existed in draft, and its existence in draft was, Fitch explained with barely contained satisfaction, in some ways more damning than if it had been filed, because it demonstrated premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. The report was referred to the county prosecutor's office. The county prosecutor was a man named Aldous Crane, who Maris had never spoken to directly, but who had, she was told by Fitch, a personal and professional hatred of land fraud that dated back to a case early in his career that had gone badly and that he had apparently never entirely gotten over. This seemed, in the current circumstances, like a useful form of unresolved professional emotion. Silas was formally charged on a Thursday morning with fraud, tampering with county records, fraudulent inducement in land transactions, and conspiracy to defraud, 14 counts across 11 years of activity. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf and filed immediately for a reduction of the charges on grounds of insufficient evidence, which was denied within the week. Maris found out about the charges the same way she'd found out about the original guardianship filing, not from a lawyer but from Martha Greer at the dry goods counter, who told her with considerably more animation than she'd had for the first piece of news, because this one traveled in a direction that people found satisfying rather than troubling, and information that satisfies people moves faster than information that worries them. She bought her lamp oil and walked out to her horse and sat on it for a moment in the middle of the main street without moving, just letting it land. 14 counts. 11 years. She thought about what it would have taken, what it had cost him in planning and patience, and the particular kind of sustained dishonesty that doesn't slip or soften or question itself, to operate a scheme of that scope for that long. She thought about all the ordinary days he must have had in between, buying things at the same stores she bought things at, speaking to the same people she spoke to, eating dinner and reading correspondence and going to sleep in a house he probably considered well-earned. She thought about how easy it apparently was to be one kind of person in public and an entirely different kind of person in the decisions that didn't have an audience. And then she thought about her father, who had been exactly the same person whether anyone was watching or not, whose private decisions and public ones had never required separate accounting, and she understood, not for the first time but more clearly than before, why that was a rarer thing than it should be, and why it had made him worth loving. She rode to Fitch's office and sat across from him and said, "What happens now?" "The criminal case proceeds," he said. "It will take time, probably more than a year before trial. His lawyers will negotiate. There may be a plea arrangement. The prosecutors have more than enough to make that advantageous for all parties." He looked at her carefully. "As for your specific situation, the inquiry's findings mean that any remaining claims he had against your property are legally moot. The easement fraud attempt is documented as fraudulent, which permanently forecloses that line of attack. The guardianship filing is already dismissed. You are, effectively, clear." She repeated the word in her head. Clear. It was such a small word for the thing it described. "Margaret Pellman," she said. "I've been looking into it, as you asked." He set his elbows on the desk. "The transaction in which he transferred the 40 acres to Voss's holding company is now flagged in the inquiry findings as fraudulent inducement. That makes it voidable, meaning she has legal grounds to challenge it and seek recovery of the property." He paused. "It will require her to pursue her own civil case. It won't be free, but the inquiry findings give her a foundation she didn't have before." "Tell her that," Maris said, "and tell her I'll help with the legal fees if she needs it." Fitch looked at her over his glasses. That's generous. It's not generous, she said. It's the right thing, and she shouldn't have to do it alone. She paused. Tell Eleanor Creedy's daughter the same. He looked at her for a long moment with that complicated expression she'd seen on him before, respect mixed with something that might have been self-reproach. I should have looked more carefully, years ago, he said, at the Pellman transaction, at the Creedy sale. I saw things that didn't sit right, and I told myself the evidence wasn't there. The evidence wasn't there, she said, not in a form you could use. He was careful. I should have been more careful, too. She didn't argue with him on that. It was true, and he knew it, and some truths were better acknowledged than smoothed over. You did the work when it mattered, she said, all 43 pages of it. That counts for something. He nodded once, set his glasses down. Is there anything else you need from me today? She thought about it. No, she said. I think that's everything. She walked out of his office into the March morning and stood on the sidewalk and tipped her face up toward the sky, which was doing that early spring thing where it couldn't quite decide between winter blue and something warmer and had settled on both at once. She stood there for 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, just standing, not thinking particularly, just presenting the day. Then she went to find Gideon. I was at the feed store at the other end of the main street, which she'd known because he'd told her that morning he needed to arrange a delivery before they lost the morning window. She found him outside, finishing a conversation with the store's owner, and she waited until the conversation ended and the owner had gone back inside, and then she walked up and said simply, 14 counts. They charged him this morning. Gideon looked at her. He read her face. You all right? Yes. She was. It still surprised her a little that the answer was yes and she meant it. I wanted to tell you first, before you heard it from someone else. He nodded. He looked out toward the far end of the street for a moment, that particular still look he got when he was processing something internally. It doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel, he said. No? I thought it would feel like more of something. He paused. It just feels like the next thing, like the thing that needed to happen, happened. She understood that exactly. I think that's what justice feels like when you've been working toward it for a long time, she said. It doesn't arrive with fireworks, it just arrives. He looked at her. You disappointed? No. She said it firmly, without hesitation. I'm relieved. There's a difference. She paused. The relief isn't even really about the charges. It's over. Whatever he was going to do next, he's not going to do it. Margaret Pellman's 40 acres might come back to her. Eleanor Creedy's family knows her mother wasn't crazy or weak for being frightened. And the people who come after us, whoever inherits land in this county after we're gone, they're going to inherit it in a county where this particular way of operating has been named and prosecuted and put on record. Gideon was watching her with that attention he had. Your father would have liked that, he said. She felt the familiar, complicated feeling, grief and warmth so thoroughly braided together that she couldn't separate them and had stopped trying. Yes, she said. He would have. They stood together on the boardwalk in the March morning, not touching, not particularly close, just standing in the same piece of the world at the same moment, and she felt the ease of it, the uncomplicated ease of standing next to someone you don't have to explain yourself to. I want to go home, she said. So do I, he said, just as simply. They rode home. April came in cold and then abruptly warm, the way spring usually did in that country. Not a gradual warming, but a hard shift, like a decision being made. The upper pasture at Hawk Ridge showed the first real green by the middle of the month, and Gideon moved the stock up to take advantage of it, and Maris spent 3 days helping repair the fence on the southern boundary that had taken wind damage over winter, which was unglamorous work involving a great deal of mud, and at least one incident where a fence post she was holding upright, while Gideon tamped the base shifted sideways, and she went down one knee into the mud and said something she didn't normally say in the presence of other people. Gideon did not comment on this. He handed her a dry cloth from his coat pocket and went back to tamping, and she appreciated the complete absence of ceremony around it more than she could have adequately expressed. Her father's house was empty. That was a fact she hadn't fully reckoned with yet. She was living at Hawk Ridge now, genuinely and by choice, and the house on her father's property sat locked with the cedar survey map, gone from its usual place on the wall because she'd brought it with her, and the furniture covered with cloth to keep the dust off, and the single crooked cedar tree standing at the edge of the yard with no one to check it before dark. She rode over one Saturday in mid-April to check the property, just to look at things, make sure the roof was holding and no one had troubled the outbuildings. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching things with a lightness that wasn't casualness, but something more deliberate. Not grieving exactly, but something related to it. The particular act of a person moving through a space that holds most of the memories of their life, and deciding, quietly and without drama, what to keep and what to release. She came back to Hawk Ridge in the late afternoon with a box of her father's books and the framed photograph of her parents that had been on the mantelpiece since she could remember. And she set the photograph on the shelf next to the survey map, and Gideon saw her do it and said nothing, which was the correct thing. That evening he came in from the barn and set something on the kitchen table while she was reading. She looked at it. It was a small wooden box, rectangular, the wood a reddish-brown cedar that he'd clearly shaped and sanded himself. There was a dovetailed joint at each corner and a fitted lid and a simple carved line along the edge that was decorative in the way that handmade things are decorative. Not ornate, not meant to impress, just evidence that someone had taken care. "For your father's papers," he said, "the loose ones in the strong box. Figured cedar was appropriate." She looked at it for a moment. She looked at him. He'd made it himself, clearly, at some point in the past weeks. She'd heard him in the outbuilding some evenings working on something and hadn't asked what, because he did things in the outbuilding regularly, and she'd learned to read the difference between the sounds of functional work and the sounds of something that was its own project. She'd registered the difference on those evenings and filed it without unpacking it. Now she understood what she'd been hearing. "Gideon," she said. "You don't have to make anything of it," he said, going to wash his hands at the basin. "I know," she said. "I'm making something of it anyway." She heard him exhale, which was very close to a laugh from him, and she ran her hand along the lid of the cedar box and felt the smooth, careful work of it, and thought that this was the thing people didn't always understand about love. That it shows up most clearly not in the declarations but in the making, in someone noticing what you need before you've named it and building it quietly in the evenings and setting it on the kitchen table without any ceremony, and that being exactly, precisely enough. The cedar saplings arrived in May. She had ordered them from a nursery 2 counties over in February, before the inquiry report, before the charges, in a period when nothing was resolved and the outcome was still genuinely uncertain, and she had done it anyway. 8 saplings, eastern red cedar, bare root, to be planted along the southern edge of the alder property to replace the windbreak that had thinned over the years, and that her father had meant to replenish and hadn't gotten to. She'd placed the order almost on impulse, and then forgotten about it until the nursery sent word that they were ready for pickup. She told Gideon about them over breakfast and asked if he wanted to come help plant them, which was not a short trip, about 4 hours round, and would take most of a Saturday. "Yes," he said, without additional comment. They drove out in the wagon, horses, not the more complicated arrangement of a buggy, on a May Saturday when the air was warm enough to work in without a coat, but cool enough that the work was actually pleasant rather than punishing. She picked up the saplings from the nursery, 8 small trees wrapped in burlap at the roots, and they drove to her father's property and spent the morning digging holes at the intervals she'd calculated and settling each sapling in with the methodical, unglamorous work that planting actually is. Dig, set, tamp, water, move to the next. Her knees was hurt by the 4th tree. She said so, out loud, without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. "Mine too," Gideon said. He was 41 and had been doing physical labor in rough country for 2 decades, and his knees apparently had opinions about it. This did not seem to diminish him in any way that she could identify. It just made him a person with knees, which she found, obscurely, a relief. They ate lunch on this tailgate of the wagon, bread and hard cheese and the last of the apples from the cellar, which were past their peak and slightly soft, and water from the canteen. They didn't talk much. The silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. When the last sapling was in the ground, they stood back and looked at the row. 8 small trees, barely knee-high, set at careful intervals along the southern boundary. They didn't look like much. They weren't much yet. In 8 years they'd be doing real work. In 20 years, they'd be the kind of windbreak that people drove past and didn't notice because it had simply always been there, had always been part of the shape of the land, and no one would remember the Saturday afternoon when two people with sore knees set them in the ground one by one. Your father planned to do this, Gideon said. He mentioned it the last summer, she said. He kept putting it off. He said the property needed them, but then something else always came up. She looked at the row of small trees. He would have hated that I got to them first. He would have said I put them 6 inches too far apart. Are they 6 inches too far apart? Probably a little, but they'll fill in. She paused. He also would have been glad. He was like that. He'd complain about the execution and be privately pleased about the result. Gideon looked at the trees. Sounds like he kept people honest. He did. She crossed her arms, not against cold, but as a comfortable position, looking at the line of small cedars catching the May light. He kept me honest, which I didn't always appreciate at the time and appreciate enormously now. They stood there for another minute, and she was aware of the whole quiet weight of the day, the sore knees and the soft apples, and the 8 small trees, and the empty house behind them with the cloth-covered furniture inside, and the fact that she had come to this property today, not as someone who lived here, but as someone who was caring for a thing she loved from a different address. She'd moved. Not dramatically, not declaratively, just moved. The way people move when they've made a decision so thoroughly that they don't remember making it, they just realize one day that they're living somewhere different than they used to live. I want to keep the property, she said. The house. I'm not selling it. I know, he said. But I want to... She paused, finding the words carefully. I want to tend it. Come out here every few weeks, check the fences, check the trees, keep it up. She looked at him. Is that... Maris, he said, with a patience that was so completely without condescension that it was almost funny. It's your land. You don't need my permission for what you do with your land. I know that, she said. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I want, so you know, so it's not just something I do without you being part of the knowing. She paused. There's a difference. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. There is. He understood the difference. She'd been learning over these months that he almost always understood the distinction between the surface of what she was saying and the thing underneath it, and that he responded to the underneath thing rather than just the surface, which was a quality that had become, without her planning for this to happen, completely essential to her. They loaded the empty burlap root wraps into the wagon and drove back toward Hawk Ridge in the late afternoon, the light going long and golden across the hills, the air starting to carry that particular early summer smell of dry grass warming in the sun. She watched the hills go by and thought about how the same road had looked to her 4 months ago, in the dark winter morning when she'd ridden it the first time, heading toward an uncertain conversation with a man she barely knew, carrying a desperation she'd been trying to manage with both hands. She wasn't carrying desperation now. She was carrying something heavier and lighter at the same time, which was strange math, but accurate. The letter from Silas came in June. Not through lawyers, not through the court. A personal letter, handwritten, delivered to the Hawk Ridge address by ordinary post, which she hadn't expected and which she looked at for a moment before opening it, because she was trying to decide whether she wanted to read it in Gideon's presence or alone. She decided alone, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she suspected she would need a clear head, and his presence, which she'd come to find steadying in most circumstances, might in this one specific case interfere with her ability to simply feel whatever she felt about the contents. She read it in the kitchen while he was out checking the north fence. It was not an apology. She hadn't expected one, and she would have trusted it less if it had been. It was 3 paragraphs, and what it said, stripped of the careful language. His lawyers had advised him that the prosecution's case was sufficient to result in conviction on most counts if the matter went to trial. He was entering into plea negotiations. Several of the 14 counts would be resolved through negotiated agreements with affected parties. He was instructing his lawyers to cooperate with the civil recovery proceedings related to the Pellman property. The 3rd paragraph was shorter than the others. It said, I am aware that you acted within your legal rights throughout this matter. I am also aware that you were more thorough than I anticipated. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement that she expected she would ever get from Silas Voss. And she read it twice, and then she sat with it, and she tried to locate the feeling it produced in her. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't triumph. It wasn't even particularly deep relief that had come earlier, in stages, over the preceding months. What it was, she decided after a few minutes of honest examination, was something closer to tiredness. The long, earned tiredness of someone who has been in a fight for long enough that the end of it doesn't produce energy, but rather the specific exhaustion that was always there underneath the effort and simply had nowhere to go while the effort was still required. She was tired of Silas Voss. She had been afraid of him for years, and then fighting him for months, and now she was just tired of him occupying space in her life. And the letter felt like the last piece of that, the final document, the last form to file, the closing of a long account. She folded it and put it in the cedar box Gideon had made her, next to her father's papers. When Gideon came in, she said, "Letter from Silas. He's entering the plea negotiations. Margaret's property is part of it." He stood in the doorway and read her face. "You okay?" "Tired," she said, "but fine." He came in, hung up his hat, went to wash his hands. "Good tired or bad tired?" She thought about it. "The kind that comes from something being done," she said. "The kind that means you can rest now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll make coffee." "I'll make it," she said and stood up. "You made it yesterday." "And the day before." "I have a system." "Your system uses too much coffee, because it makes better coffee." They argued about the coffee, gently and without resolution, and she made it her way, and they drank it at the kitchen table as the June evening came in through the windows. And the conversation moved from the coffee to the north fence to whether the upper pasture had enough growth to support the additional stock Gideon was considering. And she had opinions about the stock decision and said so, and he had opinions about her opinions and said so, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely imperfect and entirely exactly what she wanted her life to be. The trial never happened. Silas entered a formal guilty plea in August on 9 of the 14 counts, with the remaining 5 resolved through civil settlements with affected parties. The sentences included fines, restitution payments to multiple landowners, including Margaret Pellman, and a 3-year suspended sentence with the condition that he divest himself of all land holdings in the county within 1 year and not re-engage in property transactions within the county for 5 years following. He was not imprisoned. That was the part that sat uneasily with some people. Martha Greer said so plainly at the dry goods counter when Maris came in for lamp oil the week after the sentencing, in the comfortable, outraged tone of someone who has been following a situation closely. "He should have gotten jail time," Martha said. "Maybe," Maris said, "but he's losing everything he built here, the land, the company, the network, the reputation." She paused, considering. "For a man like Silas, I think losing the standing is the actual punishment. The rest of it is paperwork." Martha considered this. "You're more charitable than I'd be." "I'm not being charitable," Maris said. "I'm just being accurate." She'd thought about this question of punishment for a long time. Starting from the morning Calloway had opened the inquiry, and she'd stood on the courthouse steps thinking about Margaret Pellman's folded hands and Eleanor Creedy's daughter writing down her mother's fear. She'd thought about what she actually wanted from whatever the legal process produced, and she'd been honest with herself about the fact that what she wanted was not primarily punishment. What she wanted was for it to stop, for the pattern to be broken, for the record to exist, documented, permanent, officially named, so that this particular method of targeting the isolated and grieving and vulnerable in this county could not quietly continue as if it had never happened. The record existed. It would be in the county files, in the court documents, in Harlan Vess's 112-page report. Anyone who came looking, whether that was a future judge, a future landowner's family, a future Morris Alder trying to understand why someone was coming after them, would find it. That was enough. It was not everything she could have wanted, but it was enough, and she had learned enough in the past year to tell the difference between those two things and not confuse them. Margaret Pellman got her 40 acres back in September. The legal proceedings that restored the property were complex and expensive and took the better part of 3 months, and Maris helped with the legal fees as she'd told Fitch she would. And Margaret called her on the day the deed transfer was complete and did not say much, just, "Thank you. I want you to know I said that to your father too, years ago, when he helped my husband with something. I think it must run in the family." Maris sat with the phone. No, not a phone. It was a message, a written note delivered by hand. And she read it twice, and then she folded it very carefully and put it with the letter from Silas in the cedar box. And they were strange neighbors in there, but they belonged together, as a record of the same long, complicated thing. The last time she saw Silas was in October. She didn't seek it out. She was in Red Hollow on an ordinary errand, coming out of the dry goods store with a package under her arm, when she came around the corner and he was there. He was alone, which struck her as different from how he'd always moved through this town before. Silas Voss had always had the presence of a man who occupied more space than himself, who brought the suggestion of influence and alliance into every room. Standing alone on the boardwalk in October, he just looked like a man getting older in a town where his name no longer meant what it used to. He saw her. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, "Maris." "Silas," she said. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was so foreign to her experience of him. He looked uncertain, not guilty, not remorseful, not particularly chastened, just uncertain, as if he'd been about to say something and realized he didn't know what it was. She waited. She was in no hurry. "You didn't make this easy for me," he said finally. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. I didn't make anything difficult for you, Silas. I just made the truth impossible to ignore. Those aren't the same thing, but I understand why you'd feel like they are." He stood with that. Whatever argument or counter he'd been marshaling, if there had been one, if this had been some attempt at a final negotiation or a delayed intimidation, it seemed to dissolve against the plainness of what she'd said. He nodded, once, in a way that didn't mean agreement but meant acknowledgement, which was as much as she expected and more than she'd been certain of. He walked away down the boardwalk. She watched him go without particular feeling, not triumph, not pity, just the clear-eyed recognition of a thing that was finished. He turned the corner at the far end of the street and was gone. She stood there for a moment in the October morning, the package under her arm, the street going about its ordinary business around her, and she thought about the woman who had sat on a porch step 14 months ago looking at a crooked cedar tree and trying to figure out how to survive the next 48 hours. That woman had been frightened and alone and had made, out of necessity and nothing else, a decision that had turned out to be the best decision of her life. Not because it solved a legal problem, though it had. Not because it stopped Silas Voss, though it had done that too, eventually. But because it had led her, through all the mud and the fence line work and the kitchen table conversations and the asymmetrical pie and the cedar box dovetailed at the corners, to a life that was larger and less lonely than anything she'd been managing to build on her own. You don't always get to choose the circumstances that change your life. Sometimes the change arrives as a crisis, as a 2-day deadline, as a cold morning and a desperate ride to a ranch you've never been inside. Sometimes the thing that saves you doesn't look like saving. It looks like surviving, and only later, from a distance, do you see that the surviving was where everything actually started. She walked back to where her horse was tied. The sky was the deep October blue that only comes when the summer haze has finally cleared and everything is sharp-edged and present. She tied her package to the saddlebag and mounted and pointed the horse toward the ridge trail. Gideon was planting the last of the fall cover crop when she got home. He looked up when she rode in, and she gave him a nod that meant everything was fine, and he gave her one back that meant he'd already known it would be, and she put the horse up and went to help him with the seating, which was not glamorous work, and which left her hands dirty and her back aching by the end of it. She wouldn't have changed a single thing. That evening, after dinner, she moved the cedar survey map to a different wall, the one that caught the morning light better. Gideon watched her do it without comment, then tilted his head and said, "That's better." "I think so too," she said. Outside in the dark, the cedar windbreak along the north fence held its position against the autumn wind, roots deep, shape permanent, doing the patient work of something planted years ago by a person who understood that the future you build for is never the one you'll live to see fully formed. But that building it anyway is exactly the point. She went to bed that night in the house that was hers and listened to the wind move through the cedar trees, and she slept.